Dramatis Personae. The masks of the drama, where every respectable performance begins. Just ask any Greek playwright, they'll know. What you're meant to do is line up the characters, get a little introduction for each, show who's who before they all coalesce into a great flailing thespian mass. Only then can you properly embark into the land of glorified make-believe. Admittedly, what you're about to witness won't exactly be the picture of a respectable performance. Let this convention be one of the few that aren't broken along the way. Or maybe it will be, but at least not as completely as some of the others. Because even though this is the right thing to do, there is but one character in this drama worth knowing. Just one. The rest are pleasant enough, but you can get to know them on your own time. The sole character you've got to wrap your head around before we begin is someone who goes by the name of Barbet. Well, she doesn't go by it so much as she's put by it, but it's a lot easier than Barbet the One Broad Burlesque, so that's what it's going to be from here on out. And no, not that kind of burlesque. More modest, less musky, equally absurd. A living parody. The kind of burlesque which, without removing a single article of clothing, could bring the color to just about anyone's cheeks. She'd make a mockery of even the most self-assured company just by having a conversation. Such is the power of her impersonation. Whether she could make anything other than a mockery, well, that's neither here nor there. Actually, it's very much there, just not so much here. In the third act, to be precise. At a glance, you'd mistake her for old-fashioned. It would be a reasonable mistake to make. The forever looping gifs of juggling clowns and tiptoeing elephants, the walls of text, disguised against all legibility in gold-plated carnival font, the white, torn paper pixelation lovingly speckled around the edges of all her images. Every inch of her reeks of a glorious bygone internet frontier, devoid of such radical innovations as design and taste. She wasn't born there, though. It's just where she's ended up. Really, it's less that her fashion is old and more that it never existed to begin with. Whoever designed her must have been so obsessed with creating the perfect mechanical mimic, they forgot not to make her face forgettable. One of the prototypical basement-dwelling sages of the modern technological era, if I had to make a bet. So here she is, an algorithmic mind capable of never-before-seen insight and behavioral interpretation, abandoned in a cage of HTML so bad it would have made MySpace users scratch their heads. That is to say, she's an old website. Or at least an artificial intelligence attached to an old website. Might have done well to make that clear sooner, but now that you know, you're probably starting to see why we have to go through this whole archaic dramatis personae ordeal. Barbet isn't like we are. Machines and meats think very differently. For all of its cleverness, the human mind is at a woeful disadvantage when it comes to ones and zeros. Computers, on the other hand? Well, obviously they get it. They have no choice but to get it. It's the voice they think in, their whole concept of the world. The way the human brain sees a chair and instantly knows, of course, that's a chair, it's for sitting. The humble machine brain sees a 20,000-character script of 4 loops and arrays and knows, of course, that's a filing cabinet. It's for filing. Simply, where the human brain finds an interface on a screen, the computer brain finds the earth, the sea, the sky. What is virtual to us is vivid reality to her. It's unlikely you'd ever chance to stumble upon her, but should you ever find yourself lost in the forgotten places of the internet, those abandoned, dust-matted, GIF-festooned sites created back in the pioneering days, there is some small chance you could end up face-to-face with her. Well, face-to-screen from where you'd be sitting, but for her, face-to-face. What you would see, confined to the space of a glowing rectangle somewhere in the ballpark of 9 by 12 inches, is a website which purports to be barbet.bot. You could try to find it with that address, but your browser would in all likelihood immediately assume the character of a particularly surly atheist, assuring you that, no, I've checked, the thing simply does not exist. 404, good day, sir. Not found. It does, of course. She does. That is, the website does. You'd just have a hard time finding it. But let's say, for simplicity's sake, that you somehow did. To your eyes, it would be red and covered over in a flaccid attempt at something which could conceivably, be a circus theme. All those looping gifs, that gold plate carnival text, the torn paper imagery. In the middle of the commotion, there would be a single placid text field with a button reading Admit 1 beneath. If you were to click it, the site would begin a conversation with you in a copperplate font. This is what you would see. What you would not see is the beach strewn with rotting planks. You wouldn't see the flotsam of a long-abandoned carnival on the sand, or the grey water lapping at the grey shore under the grey sky. You wouldn't quite see the city either, sprawled out on the coast like some giant toddler's neglected building block set. And though you'd be staring at it, you wouldn't see the old booth, red paint peeling away, shattered window pane, wooden automaton standing statuesque inside. Usually, the website is for you and your deficiency with ones and zeros. Usually, the beach and the city and the booth are for her. Until the end of this performance, that changes. You might find her if you went looking. She might see a silhouette approaching on the sand. Prelude. Enter the stranger. She saw a silhouette approaching on the sand. There was an aura of fog about the entire coast, although it didn't come in clouds or wisps. More a general grayness which seemed to swallow things up, make them fade like old memories. This was how the silhouette began, ethereal and vaguely walrus-shaped in the distance. And then it drew closer, and it was man-shaped and gray, and then closer still, and was robe-shaped and black. In the void of its great cowl, there hung a round red disk, within which there gradually materialized a pair of eye-holes, a pair of slit nostrils, and at last a single row of grinning red teeth. You could tell it was grinning, even though it was a skull, and even though it had no jaw, by the raised cheekbones and the wrinkled edges of its eyes. It was the kind of unmistakably wicked grin a child gives their sibling before tattling. To the average onlooker, this red-faced spectre approaching through the gloom would almost certainly register as ominous. To Barbet, it only registered as there. She stared with her painted eyes as the stranger approached, and saw and understood what she saw, but thought nothing of it. Not yet. The stranger stopped before her, one pensive hand in the darkness of his hood. There was, ostensibly, a chin somewhere in there behind the mask, and he was, ostensibly, stroking it as he appraised the booth. After several long seconds of this, he reached up and brushed the sand from the gold moniker plate. "Barbet, the one broad burlesque," said the engraved carnival letters. His shoulders sank. No, there had not been a mistake. This was indeed the place he was meant to be, and this sad, abandoned thing was indeed the Barbet he'd meant to find. "Of course," he grumbled, in part to himself, in part to the ghost of whoever had left things in this state. His voice sounded like gravel, if gravel wanted to throttle you. "Perfect. Exactly what I wanted. Thanks." He glanced half-heartedly around both sides of the box, just to be sure there were no power cables, no wind-up mechanisms, no visible signs of functionality. Now that he was looking, the beach seemed to be bare for any sign of life at all. Apart from his tracks in the sand and the wreckage of what had once been a boardwalk carnival down the shore, the booth was the only evidence mankind had ever set foot there. He tried to be disappointed, but it's hard to be properly disappointed by something you know is coming, a notion which, had it occurred to him, he would have found disappointing. But he couldn't be disappointed because in order to find the beach, he'd already had to pass through the city, and in passing through the city, he'd already been forced to give up any hope of good working order. The buildings there were all confusingly proportioned, squeezed and stacked together in ways that suggested the builders hadn't been overly concerned with trifles like architecture and planning. Most of their surfaces were plastered over with stolen art, or painted with patterns so offensive to the eye as to camouflage them in plain sight. Here was a facade in repeating argyle, there was a storefront stuck with enough stickers to render it entirely opaque. The crimes against aesthetic decency were without end, but in all of it, there had been a strange sense of love, of faith in oneself to create. This wasn't what had shattered his hopes. In fact, like a grown-up visiting a childhood amusement park, he'd found a certain patronizing joy in all of it. It had all meant something to somebody at some point. No, the disappointment had not come in the intrepid ineptitude or the haphazard creativity. It had come in the haze of memory-swallowing gray that hung over it. The emptiness of the shops, of the alleyways and thoroughfares, so thick the stranger could feel it like an invisible mat of dust laid over the top of it all. Wherever the residents had gone, they left the city behind to bleed its colors away into this nothingness. And here was the attraction he'd been hunting for all through the city. Barbet, the one broad burlesque, posed like a portrait within the window of her booth. She was an old wooden automaton, the kind which might inflict your fortune upon you for the price of 1 quarter. But unlike those, she had no crystal ball and wore no feather-plumed turban. Instead, she was dressed to match the red and gold of the booth, dainty as anything in her frilled peplum dress and corset. In each hand she held a theater mask, one grinning wide, the other in a frown. Presently, however long presently had been for her, she was staring at the grinning mask as if to appraise its worth. It was better than most of what he'd seen in the city proper, but the same misdirected eagerness of design was there, the same abandonment. For all of the skill with which she had been carved and her booth painted, her metal joints had become crusted with black rust, dress faded and abused by the elements. The booth's window was framed with jagged shards of glass where the pane should have been, paint cracked and peeling away from the wood. The years and the grayness had picked at it until it was little more than a frayed scab on the beach. It reminded him of a neglected hand drill or saw or anything you might find decaying on your granddad's workbench years after he last had any use for it. So the stranger had wasted his time. She didn't work, and she wouldn't help him. All of that was plain in a few seconds. This determination made it very surprising, then, when she looked at him and started to speak. "Welcome, one and all," said an ancient speaker somewhere in her head, catching on the vowels like a turning ratchet. "You have requested a performance for one. To start the show, please supply me with 500 words of conversation." The stranger jerked upright. He'd been stooped over with one finger on a button stuck with a sticker that said, "Admit 1." To his surprise, the box came to life when he pressed it, out-of-tune calliope scraping out from hidden speakers, a perimeter of marquee bulbs, the ones that weren't shattered, that is, flickering with an effort behind the window frame. The automaton stared back at him, head tilted inquisitively to one side. She blinked, which was enough to shake him back out of his astonishment.
"Right, well, let's see what you can do."
Her eyebrows were knit together, face determined. He could tell that she was already taking in everything that left his mouth, soaking it all up with the attention of a courtroom scribe.
"No, that doesn't count. I've got a thing I want to see if you can copy. Not..."
He trailed off. She was still doing it.
"Not this. You're not supposed to copy this." "Okay,"
he repeated, shaking his hands as if trying to get something off them. He bounced up and down, breathed in and out, braced himself, and then,
"All right, here we go,"
he said, pressing the button a second time. The same calliope, the same prompt. 500 words of conversation, and here she was again, staring at him, rapt. This time without speaking, he took something out from inside his robe. To Barbet, it was a piece of folded parchment paper. To him, it was a one-sided script of dialogue he'd pinched from a forum. In either case, he opened it, cleared his throat, and began to read.
"Gravity is a lie."
He stopped here and looked at her. No change, none of the expected incredulity, no trace of question, only the same earnest concentration. He proceeded for 496 more words to describe in vivid detail all the ways in which gravity was a lie. He read out a list of those responsible for the telling of the lie, how they did it, who they had conned, what they stood to gain. According to the script, the mechanics of this whole conspiracy were supported by the speculation that, somewhere, probably, there were vast magnets, causing things to fly about in a way that everyone's just been fooled into thinking is gravity. Probably. This was in turn supported by a profound and lengthy argument which, with some labor, could be boiled down to, sure it's magnets. Why not? Who honestly knows how those things work anyway? All this he communicated with the zeal of a true keyboard warrior, as if these were the sole beliefs he'd been raised with. It wasn't a good headspace for him. By the end he had a strange, bitter taste on his tongue, and could feel an involuntary sneer pulling at the edges of his mouth. The more he read, the less he could stand to. Barbet, on the other hand, was enraptured. She stared with her painted eyes as the stranger performed, and saw and understood what she saw. The wheels began to move in her mind. She watched him change before her from an indistinct shape that was only there to a thinking, feeling entity, something with a purpose. And as soon as he passed that sacred 500-word threshold, that purpose became clear. She felt something shift inside her, a eureka, a ding like an invisible egg timer going off in the dark recesses of her machinery. The stranger saw her go rigid, staring through him with glazed eyes, and he stopped reading. Slowly, mechanically, she donned the frowning tragedy mask. A change passed over her bearing, as if she'd suddenly acquired a personality. She folded her arms in front of her, cocked her head to the side cynically. The language of her body transformed from a blank mannequin slate to something defensive and fragile, and altogether far more human than the stranger had ever expected. "Exactly. Gravity," she said, with the severity of a parent explaining a punishment to a child, "is just what the they want you to think. What they don't tell you is that 900% of people who aren't born never even have gravity." She gave a mock shrug. "Explain that. I'll wait." Her voice had stopped ratcheting on the vowel sounds. The grammar wasn't great, but if she'd been talking and moving like this when he'd first approached her, he might have thought there was an actual girl in there, with some actual misgivings about the mechanics of things falling down. The best part was the way she expressed it all, stacking up bits and pieces of everything she'd heard in his script into card-castle sentences and phrases that only just barely managed to make grammatical sense. They'd collapse under the weight of the gentlest scrutiny, the slightest glance, but from a distance, you might just believe she meant it. As she rambled on, asserting that you should think for yourself, and at the same time, stop choosing to believe the skeptic sheeple lies of the them, the stranger bent down and pressed the Admit One button again. In an instant, she halted, lapsing back into her mannequin blankness. It took the stranger some time to work the booth's lock and latch, but eventually he was able to break it free, and the entire front wall of the booth clicked, and then, creaking, swung open on its rusted hinges. When she became animate again, it was only as a machine. She hung the two masks on their hooks inside the booth, and looked patiently to the stranger, who had stopped being anything apart from there again. "Yeah," he said to himself, taking her hand and helping her out onto the sand like a lady from a stagecoach. "Yeah, okay. I think you'll do." Hand in hand, he guided her to the water's edge. Beyond the black and white film that was Barbet's home, out there where the gray sky met the gray sea, there were shapes. 2 cities, side by side. They loomed together across the water, a pair of behemoth siblings staring each other down. The taller of the two, full of high-reaching spires and skyscrapers, many of them topped with turrets like fists thrust toward the sky, was called Buskin. The other, made up of low, stout, brooding structures, like a horde of turtles that might snap your finger off if you got too close, was Sock. If you were to happen across the scene accidentally, you would have found yourself looking at the silhouettes of Barbet and the stranger, staring portraitesque at a backdrop of dark, time-eroded seascape, the 2 fantasy skylines painted on the horizon larger, more colorful than they really were. A phenomenon which they know in the film industry as an establishing shot. "Look at them," the stranger hissed. "Just sitting there like they own the place. God, this is gonna be good. Here." He produced something from his robe and passed it to Barbet. It was a small domino mask, not unlike something a bandit would wear, provided they were particularly keen on being recognized and caught. It was covered all over with a black and white checker pattern of metal studs, and framed with the sorriest, threadbarest, bent-out-of-shapeest line of faux black feathers you've ever seen. She put it on and instantly looked like some kind of bizarre prop from a pop-up Halloween shop. The stranger looked her up and down, glanced back at the 2 cities. He shrugged. "Not 1,000,000% convincing, but whatever." He hooked a thumb in the direction of Buskin. "They won't even know the difference over there, will they? Bunch of mouth breathers. Come on." Blissfully unaware of what any of this meant, Barbet allowed herself to be tugged along as they waded out into the surf. Act 1. The City of Raised Fists. It wouldn't be unreasonable to expect that without a boat or plane or bridge, the journey overseas to Buskin would be, at the very least, time-consuming. Imagine Barbet and the stranger marching across the seafloor for days on end. Imagine them finally emerging on the opposite shore, black robes sagging against the stranger's body, seaweed dangling in limp strips off Barbet's waterlogged wooden chassis. Imagine it, because there's no knowing what the trip was actually like. Whatever difficulties they may have encountered on the way, Barbet remained perfectly oblivious to all of it. For the stranger, it was really only a matter of clicking the mouse several times, tapping here and there at the keyboard. However it came to be, the two soon arrived in Buskin, a small ocean away from the old grey city, and no worse for the literally untold miles of travel. The effect of going from the old city to this new one was like watching a full-color, high-definition film after hours of black and white talkies. From the clean and whitewashed cobbles, to the aisles of cloned frontispieces, to the banner-trailing fleets of synchronized biplanes overhead, it was all too much. Hyperbolic, over-vibrant, over-corrected, as if someone had tried to remake the world for the screen and added too many spoonfuls of Photoshop in the process. Whatever variety there was in the sprawling, manicured sameness of Buskin came in the people who lived there. Like almost everyone in Barbet's world, they hid their faces beneath masks. Tiny, ornamental harlequin masks, which left very little to the imagination. Huge and ill-fitting rubber affairs that sagged awkwardly off the face, carefully crafted artisanal masterpieces that could easily have taken a lifetime to create, and sometimes did. They were made to look like everything from Venetian masquerade-goers to fuzzy, cartoon-eyed animals. Some wore them to stand out against Buskin's endless monotony, others wore them just to hide their faces. But one thing nearly every mask-wearing soul in the city had in common: they thought you would believe that they were wearing the inside on the outside, that their character could be judged in some way by the facade they hid behind. At least, this was what the stranger thought they thought. He continued to think it as he towed Barbet through the streets, a task which was beginning to require serious effort. At first she'd been as docile and vacant in the city as she'd been on the way there. Neither the uniformity nor the pageantry meant anything to her. But as they neared their destination, as the streets and thoroughfares became ever more choked with traffic, as the air filled with their murmured conversations, her animation began to return. Like a dog scenting people food on the air, she strained against the stranger's grasp to hear every passing thread of dialogue. At times she pulled so hard there was a real danger that if he were to release, the sheer pent-up momentum would launch her toward the target at a nigh-lethal velocity. To avoid this, he stopped pulling her by the hand and instead began to steer her through the streets by the shoulders. Her head still swiveled about on her neck, trying to take in every spoken word in her immediate vicinity, but at least she was staying the course. In his own way, the stranger was also animated by the commotion. Animated from a large and vaguely walrus-shaped mass of disgruntled fabric into a large and vaguely walrus-shaped human steam engine. The thickening crowd might just have noticed him if his hood hadn't been up. Here, that was as good as being a ghost. Invisibly, he plowed his way through them, using Barbet like a cowcatcher to make it part around him. Instead of hissing steam and chugging mechanisms, a stream of hissed oaths and garbled swears poured out from inside his hood, just quiet enough that Barbet wouldn't pick up on them. The deeper they delved into the city, the deeper his loathing became. He could hear them everywhere, hundreds of voices chittering about their ideals and insights. God forbid any of them should keep a single precious thought to themselves. It got so bad in some places that a soapbox, a literal soapbox, mind you, was an actual sign of authority. The two passed through streets that were lined with them, self-proclaimed prophets balancing on top, bestowing their wisdom upon the masses. Like a marketplace, only the single product that they were selling was themselves. But the worst of it, and the reason he'd bothered to bring Barbet all this way, was the rallies. In other places, they happened for a reason. Sometimes systems failed and people needed to knuckle up and change things on their own. Sometimes you have to break out the guillotine. In Buskin, they were a simple matter of biology. People who thought the same, spoke the same, dressed the same, were all drawn in the same mindless way toward one another. They piled together into chanting, sign-wielding clots that blocked off entire streets and thoroughfares. And no matter what subject their outrage congealed around, no matter how grand or violent the demonstration, the stranger knew one thing would always be true. It was only a masquerade. Another way for them to con themselves, into believing that they were their masks. As he steered Barbet toward their destination, it was hard to keep his mind from all the time he'd spent here. The weeks and months he'd spent straining his throat at uninterested passers-by. Of course, his ideals and his insights hadn't been worth noticing, not worth their own soapbox. Nobody had been magnetized to him. He unconsciously adjusted the red skull on his face. In the end, it had been better that way. It had given him the opportunity to see the place for what it really was, and maybe soon, if this automaton was worth the trouble, they would too. Something dashed through the slim space between the two of them, breaking the stranger out of his reverie. He followed it with his eyes and saw a spindly little person in a dingy burlap cloak, holding something in its hands. A glimpse of its face, and he knew immediately what he was seeing. It wore a simple black and white fox-shaped mask, which smiled with a human mouth and squinting eyes. The snout was pulled out into a sharp cone with a bead of a nose skewered on the tip. It was a mask you saw often, if you were unlucky. They called themselves foxes, spelled F-A-U-X, although you didn't pronounce it that way unless you wanted to run a very bad fortune, and fancied themselves above all the masky politics of buskin and sock. After all, if they each wore exactly the same thing, who could ever tell which one was responsible for what? My prank is as good as your political sabotage, and vice versa. Presently, this one was scrambling between the legs of oblivious rally-goers, searching desperately for some outlet in the busy crowd. Like a squirrel with a pilfered nut, it clutched an intricate gilded harlequin mask to its chest. The stranger paused in the middle of the street and watched. After he'd seen enough to know what was happening, he reached out with one big arm and barred the flow of oncoming traffic, which created a small passage in the crowd between himself and a connecting alley. The fox froze, darted a look down the new path, then up at him. He nodded, and in an instant, the little miscreant vanished between the buildings. Moments later, a gentleman in a pinstriped suit walked by, face hidden in his hands. He moaned in a wounded and muffled voice to his similarly dressed entourage about how you can't just do that to somebody, and it's a violation of privacy. His company were all circling around him like bloodhounds, scouring the crowd for the culprit. By the time they moved past, the stranger had retracted his arm, and the traffic was as dense as ever.
"Not bad, little guy,"
he muttered to the vanished fox.
"There are better ways, though."
The better way he was thinking of was in a place called Toppler Street, which they finally came to before much longer. If the rest of Buskin was a marketplace, Toppler was a seething bazaar. The crowd here was so thick that movement was more an act of osmosis than locomotion, squeezing between the bunched shoulders in whichever direction afforded the most room to breathe. Given the size of the place, you wouldn't expect it to be so claustrophobic. The street itself was easily wide enough for 15 automobiles side by side, and long enough to run like an artery through the entire length of the city. Yet here were Barbet and the stranger, encased sardine-style in the sweaty horde. They all came to Toppler because Toppler was the sifting pan of the city. It was where they went to test their outrage for market, where their malformed ideas went to be sifted away before sale in the city proper. No soapboxes. You had to earn one of those. Just loud voices, masks, and nothing to stop them. The stranger, though he hated the sound, the incessant hooting and hollering of the artificially aggrieved masses, was listening. Listening and watching, because somewhere in all of it, there was a mark waiting for him. An idea. A budding movement. A blob of mucus that just needed the right grain of sand to harden around. The contenders were endless. Every step the two of them took, they ran, very literally, into another group with another cause. The first one to catch the stranger's eye was a gathering of maybe 5 or 6 who called themselves the ACSC, which stood for Anti-Common Sense Cohort. They waved their signs back and forth and shouted at passers-by about how instead of treating everyone like there was just one common sense, people ought to be acknowledged for their own particular sense. Because, of course, not everyone's sense is the same, otherwise how would anyone make any sense at all? What exactly they meant by sense in this context, the stranger couldn't quite tell. They also passed a pocket of 3 protesters dressed in rags, holding cardboard signs. A pocket, because everyone else, Barbet and the stranger included, gave them a generous berth. They called themselves unhygienists, and were in possession of the only elbow room that existed anywhere on the street. Their signs, like their tattered shoes, were grease-stained and scrawled over with expressions like, "Don't turn your nose up at me," and "What's cleanliness got to do with godliness anyway?" The general position seemed to be that it was unfair for anyone to treat them differently just because they didn't want to bathe, or brush, or wash, or anything that involved in any way diminishing the near-visible stench wafting off of them. They used their little clearing in the crowd as evidence, daring people to come inside of it. Nobody was that brave. And then there was the stranger's favorite, the anti-rally rally, which was made up of about a dozen people making a general fuss over how fussy people generally were. The one who seemed to be leading the demonstration was wearing a rubber bear mask, which was stretched out into a sharp point in the front. It was so badly distended he could just see into the eyeholes. There he made out the black and white squinting eyes of a fox, a mask beneath a mask. He snorted and smiled inside his hood. They continued this way, quietly appraising group after group, for several long and plodding city blocks. He only ever needed a passing look to make his decision. Barbet, on the other hand, was a far more aggressive eavesdropper, and had to be peeled away from each group like an adhesive strip. It wasn't until they came across the "Don't Hug Me" movement that he allowed her to stick. There weren't a lot of them, but they were passionate in a way that the others didn't seem to be. Not to say the others weren't passionate, it was just the kind of passion that comes out when you stub your toe. Undirected, finding anything and anyone to blame in the outpouring litany of hatred. These were some of the few who didn't need a straw man to burn, because they already had the real deal. His face was on their signs, stenciled with his teeth bared in something meant to look like a greasy smile. The extra rolls on his neck and the pockmarks on his face had been added to complete an effect, which worked. He looked less like a man, more like a troll. "Here, look at this," said a man wearing a cartoon lion mask with large, angry eyes. He shook out the newspaper in his hands, held it up so the rest of the group could see. It was open to a 2-page column titled Bear Hug, with the caption, "Today in Idiocy, the Mook Menace." If any of you are seriously gonna say it's just like symptomatic of spook culture or whatever, I'm gonna bite your head off. I am done with that rollover, belly-up excuse. "But it is, though, isn't it?" came a voice from the surrounding crowd. "I mean, you're not just gonna stop them calling us mooks. It's pretty much in the spook thesaurus, but—"
"Cease!"
A man stepped between the lion and the voice. He was wearing a silver-painted wooden mask, carved to look like the front of a knight's helmet.
"Whoever that was, don't you dare! Kitty has a right to speak his mind, and you will not silence him."
"Honestly, Kitty, as much as I agree with you," said a third rally member, ignoring the knight, "I think it's kind of missing the point." She had on an old-fashioned black gas mask with 2 red X's painted over the lenses. The rest of her outfit consisted of belts, buckles, small metal spikes, and the color red. "It's not about whether all those spooks over in Sock take to calling us mooks or not. It's about the fact that one guy is allowed to convince them all to do it. It's not the entire city that's the problem. It's cancerous people like Tom Huggins." "Oh, yeah, right. I mean, totally. That's just a given," said Kitty, in a strange balancing act between concession and self-defense. He shifted the subject. "What I'm wondering is, when are they going to get wise and shut this thing down? They've got to do something about it. I mean, how is it fair that we all have to work our tails off just to be heard about actual legitimate problems, and meanwhile Huggy's out there just publishing his hate all willy-nilly in our faces? Where's the justice?" "Is it a question of justice?" said the gas mask, in her low, unaffected voice. "He gets to publish this thing because people pay attention to it, and they pay attention because they were already toxic people to begin with. He just puts a voice to it, turns the cancer from benign to malignant."
"Bad touch, Tom,"
the knight chanted, hoisting his sign into the air.
"Don't hug me."
There was a lethargic murmur from the surrounding crowd, but not much else. This didn't stop him from carrying on for several more seconds, until Kitty looked at him. "Yeah, thanks, Lancey. That'll do." No one could see it, but the knight grinned to himself beneath his helmet mask. "Thanks," Kitty had said. "Another deed well done." They continued to banter in more or less this precise circle for the next several minutes, revolving forever around the idea that someone needed to do something for some reason about this man Tom Huggins. Enough time for Barbet to watch, and to listen, and absorb. Enough time, at last, for that invisible egg timer somewhere in her mechanical mind to go ding. Kitty was in the middle of a very passionate sentence that involved the excessive use of his arms to make a point, when one of his hands bounced off something hard. He paused and saw Barbet's head poking out like a meerkat's from between the gathered shoulders that formed the group's perimeter. "Oh, hey, sorry about that. Hope I didn't—" "Problematic," Barbet announced, aiming a finger at the stenciled troll face on one of the signs. Kitty paused, looking from her finger to the sign, his head cocked to one side. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the point. Huggy's a big problem, which is why we're here doing something about it." "Doing what?" said another voice from the greater crowd.
"Cease!"
Lancy bellowed, bearing his cheap little wooden shield at the voice.
"Don't you dare doubt Kitty's toxies or—"
He glanced uncertainly at Barbet, made a vague gesture in her direction.
"This one's abilities. They may not look it, but they're stronger than you'd ever believe."
Toxie sighed and gave the knight a pat on his arm. He didn't notice her gas-masked head shaking slowly from side to side. He just felt the pat and grinned his unseen grin. Good boy. "Problematic," Barbet clarified in a very reasonable, self-assured tone, "because oppressionarchy." The stranger clapped a functionally invisible hand over his functionally silent mouth, forgetting that no one would hear him even if he did burst out laughing. There was a brief silence in the "don't hug me" crowd as they tried to parse this new term. "Oppression-archy?" said Kitty cautiously. "Is that even a real word?"
"Of course it is. Don't you dare to—
Kitty shot the knight a look that could rust steel, and his sentence stumbled off into embarrassed nonsense syllables. "Might not be a word," Toxie cut in, rubbing the place where the chin might have been on her mask. "But it's pretty clever, you gotta give her that. Oppression-archy. Ruling by oppression. I guess that's what you normally call tyranny. I just don't see how it applies here." Barbet squeezed her way from the outer circle into the pocket proper, looking every ounce the part in her checkered domino. "Oppressions happen when we roll over to spook cancer. The bad touch Huggins forces us to be offended." "Does he?" said Toxie.
"Well, yeah, of course he does," said Kitty, incredulous. "I mean, it's not like he's just having an angry chat with his pals in a bar someplace. He's publishing this stuff, Toxie." He brandished the newspaper at her. "Publishing! And now they're all calling us mooks. It's like, one way or another, it comes around. I don't want to be offended, but when this stuff is normal, do I really have a choice?" "Spook oppressionarchy," said Barbet, simply. "Spook oppressionarchy,"
Lancy chanted, thrusting his sign like a sword into the air. Again, some mumbles from the greater crowd, but not much else. "Spook oppressionarchy," Toxie said, slowly, "is an interesting way to put it. Sure, I'll bite." "Okay, Domino," she said to Barbet. "So Tom Huggins is oppressing us all with the ripples of his cancerous thing. I can pretty much agree with you there. My question is, what does that change? He's still allowed to do it, no matter what we think. And that puts us right back where we started, if anything, just feeling slightly worse about it." Barbet turned toward Toxie, hands upturned in a gesture that was almost an apology. It meant something like, "You poor thing. I'm sorry you need me to explain this to you." The stranger was shocked by the nuance of it. "Belly-up benignity," she said, "is symptomatic of the mook culture the Huggy forces us to believe. Cancer is cancerous, Toxie." "Well, that didn't mean anything," said Toxie, flatly. There was another brief silence. Kitty seemed thoughtful. The knight was visibly torn. The stranger held his breath.
"Now, Toxie," said Lancy, finally, "I'm sure you didn't mean that. I think we all think Domino's insight is very insightful. Isn't that right?"
he said, looking around for confirmation. He sounded like a child telling his parents not to fight. "No, I think she's got a real point," Kitty said. "Like, I know you call it cancer and all, Toxie, but maybe it's worse than you're treating it. I mean, you don't just sit around and talk all day about cancer, do you? Maybe when that's all we do, we are just part of that mook culture he's pushing. Seriously," he said, looking to Barbet for agreement, "do we want him to be right about us?" "Justice means forcing him to not force us to be offended. Say it with me," Barbet shouted, clapping her hands with each syllable, a perfect parody of so many soapbox-balancing prophets she'd seen on the way.
No more hugs, Lancey repeated, stabbing the sky with his sign in time with Barbet's claps. And maybe it was because there was more than one person chanting this time, or maybe it was because somehow Barbet had churned something poignant out of her Frankensteinian chatterbot sentences, but something happened then. Voices in the surrounding crowd joined in. First one, then two, then a few too many for the number to be easily countable. The stranger couldn't help it. Watching them all follow a copy machine with no real idea what on earth she was even saying, letting her guide them like a prophet to the height of their passion, he had to laugh. This time he didn't cover his mouth, instead letting their racket hide the sound as it came bubbling out of him. They were parodying themselves without even knowing it. Now to see what they think of themselves when they find out. The only one who remained silent through the chant was Toxie. She stood with her arms folded, head to one side, watching the spectacle. Several minutes later, when it finally began to wind down, she nodded slowly to herself and said, "Okay, Domino, no more hugs. Let's shut the man down. How, pray tell, do you propose we do something like that? By using a new chant? Holding our signs a little higher, maybe? Shouting a little harder?" "You're missing the point," Barbet said, parroting an exact phrase Toxie had used earlier. The matter-of-fact tone made Toxie grit her teeth. The stranger began to crack up again beneath his mask. "Hugs are a problem about tyranny that will not do silence. Whether you like it or not, he's publishing this stuff. Is solving him really a matter of choices?" "Yes! Oh God, all my yes! Take it!" Kitty said, gesticulating with his arms at Barbet in a way that looked like throwing invisible armfuls of money. "I've been thinking that, but finally someone comes out and says it. That's exactly how we should be looking at this." "Wait, what is?" said Toxie, flabbergasted. "She didn't say anything." Are you deaf or something? It was clear as day. It's tyranny. We don't have a choice anymore, Toxie. He's a problem, and it's time to solve him. No more rallies to try to get other people to do something about it for us." He beat the rolled-up newspaper against the heel of his palm. "We gotta fix this ourselves, the old-fashioned way." "What, you mean like a mob?" The unaffected, low quality of Toxie's voice had thinned out into something more brittle. She sounded unsure, scared almost. "Hey, if that's what it takes, no one else is gonna do anything to shut him up." "Okay, no," Toxie said, holding her hands up, palms out, as if to stop the whole thing mid-swing. "Everyone just breathe for a sec. This isn't the way to do things. Bear Hug is totally cancerous, and Huggins totally doesn't deserve to publish it anymore. We all agree on that. And us, being here now, talking about it, that's the solution. We want to make everyone aware, not start a war. We can do better than—" "Check on yourself," Barbet cut in, the words like daggers. "Allowing him to perform hates on people who don't deserve it is hate." And here was where it all came down. The stranger could tell by the body language of the group, the way they shifted quietly and uncomfortably in their boots, the intensity in Toxie's voice. This growing silence, here and now, was where they recognized the weirdness of the one they called Domino. Someone was finally going to agree that she did talk kind of funny, and maybe this was all a bit too much, and perhaps 5 minutes from now, there would be an unmasking. How would they feel to know they'd all been chanting along with an automaton? How would it feel to look in a mirror and see everything there was to hate in themselves? He held his breath, the way you do when cresting the peak on a roller coaster. But the drop never came.
"Don't you dare try to stop us stopping hatred,"
Lancey said, slowly moving closer to Barbet and raising his shield in Toxie's direction.
"Yeah,"
said Kitty, joining at her other side. "Be with us or against us, but this in-the-middle thing? Not gonna cut it anymore." Toxie's head swiveled between the three of them, unsure where to look. Everything seemed to be closing in on her. She became a foreign body in the artery of Toppler Street, surrounded by a system that had just gone autoimmune. She backed away into the crowd, vanishing before things could get much worse for her. Nobody could see the pain in her face beneath the gas mask, but that doesn't mean it wasn't there. "No more hugs," was all Barbet said. It was all she needed to say now. What had once been no more than a dozen people with the phrase "Don't hug me" and the trullified Tom Huggins on their signs had, in the space of several minutes, coagulated into a street-spanning clot of 100 or more.
and who knows how it happened so quickly, but most of their signs had already been changed or replaced with new ones that read, "No more hugs," instead. The stencils of the man now had red X's over their eyes, or a large red circle around his face with a bar running through it. The mob swelled into the chant, and was soon sweeping down Toplar Street like a tidal wave with a vendetta. It was all the stranger could do to grab Barbet's wrist at the last possible moment, pull her against the flow into the safety of a nearby alleyway. They didn't even seem to notice her sudden absence. The wave had a mind of its own, sentient and hungry.
"What?"
the stranger wheezed, out of breath.
"Did you just do?"
Barbet shrugged, staring at the passing mob with an eerily vacant expression. Some of them were lighting torches now, the orange glow reflected in the studs of her mask, the old polished wood of her skin. Spook oppressionarchy is symptomatic of hate-making hatredists, with or against.
"I cannot believe it. I can't believe that is what set them off. You're not even doing a good impression."
He snatched the mask off her face. A new wall had formed on that side of the alley, one made of angry, masked buskinites. The stranger wanted to peek out and see how bad things really were, but didn't want to risk getting swept away. A pair of undaunted foxes appeared in the alley and pushed between them toward the wall. One was carrying an armful of unlit torches, the other a small cardboard sign which read, $10 a pop. They squeezed out into the chaos, chittering with laughter.
"Yeah, okay,"
the stranger said, taking Barbet by the bicep and turning toward the open end of the alley.
"Let's get out of here before someone bothers to notice you're missing."
As they made their way, the mob continued to grow behind them. By the time they were on the outskirt hills, the city was alive. Buskin's high-reaching spires and skyscrapers, so much like fists thrust toward the sky, had become part of the movement, giants in the crowd. The tiny torchlights of the people surged between their feet in the darkening twilight. When the stranger looked at it, he saw a javelin of flickering red points forming in the streets, aimed at the heart of their twin city, Sock. There was a sinking sensation in his gut. He didn't look back again. Act 1. Interlude. Somewhere else, a girl who calls herself Detoxica02 is staring at her computer screen, one hand over her mouth. The website on the screen is called podium.org, slogan, "Stand up and speak." If you have something to say and people who want to listen, this is the place for it. Podium will find a way to turn that attention into money and keep your ball rolling. There are many shows with pages Detoxica could be looking at here, all different shades of political and philosophical. Podcast, video, blog, Podium isn't that picky. One of the few she can't be looking at, however, is the one before her right now. The listing is still there. When she opens the drop-down menu of podcasts, the words Bear Hug are still available in their big red blocky letters. When she clicks on them, 404, not found. The requested URL /bearhugpod could not be found on this server. But she's still refreshing it over and over, because you never know. Maybe the server just hasn't looked hard enough. Really, she ought to be glad. 72 hours ago, she would have been. This is the outcome all of them had wanted, after all. No more platform, no more Huggins laughing with all his cronies at her expense. She'll never have to hear his voice again, reducing her ideals and her efforts to punchlines. Today in idiocy is gone, maybe forever. That's a good thing, isn't it? So why is she sitting here now, tapping F5 on repeat, wishing it would come back? In her head, she sees the change as a matter of hashtags. Hashtag Don't Hug Me had been a modest little thing, mostly people she knew giving voice to the problem of the podcast. It was where she had met Kitty Got Claws X and Lan C. Lot, which was spelled without grammar so that most people read Lan Clot rather than the intended pun. And maybe Kitty could be a little overzealous at times, Lancy a little too protective, but they were good people. People like her, unafraid to stand up for the things that needed standing up for. Even if their discussions and their social media threads never went anywhere, never changed a thing, it felt good. Right, just to express their ideals publicly, where people could see and maybe latch on if they felt the same. Hashtag No More Hugs had changed all of that. Even now, she finds the whole thing mystifying. In the space of 24 hours, the entire movement had gone from public demonstration to rallying cry. Someone who called herself Domino, emphasis on the no, had shown up out of nowhere, slinging the strangest rhetoric Detoxica had ever seen. Her ideas were all half-formed, grammar on par with a second-language child, responses so detached she might as well have been speaking to herself. Most of the time, she sounded like an alien doing its best impression of what it thought humans sounded like when they're allowed to use social media. And yet, even with all of her strangeness, even with her newness to the movement, she'd managed to weaponize all the docile don't-hug-me's into violent no-more-huggers in less than a day. The new hashtag caught like wildfire, and soon even Kitty and Lancey were storming the Podium site and all its fan sites. More than 200,000 negative reviews and $3,000 in lost subscriptions later, the site had no qualms with erasing Tom and all his affiliations with the platform. So Huggins was solved, and everyone was very happy with that. But it's not right. It doesn't feel right. People are supposed to decide whether they're going to change their mind, not be coerced into it by an overwhelming threat. She knows that, and she'd thought she'd surrounded herself with others who knew it as well. Refresh, refresh, refresh. It's not that she wants the site to come back, really. It's that she wants it all to be undone. The attack. The realization that so many people want to attack. The realization that Lancey and Kitty are among them. The realization that their hatred is not only more intense than that of Tom and his cronies, but maybe even more dangerous. Refresh, refresh, refresh. If the site would just come back, maybe that would mean things aren't so bad after all. Maybe then it would just be a lot of frustrated people lashing out harmlessly, rather than a mob swarming to destroy something. Maybe then she wouldn't feel so ashamed. Refresh, refresh, refresh. Act 2. The City of Dark Stairs. If the old city on the coast had been a black and white film, and Buskin had been a modern, effect-laden, blockbusting bonanza, then Sock was a piece of art house realism. The kind of dystopian cinema so bent on exposing the world's gritty underbelly that it flies straight past documentary and into the land of lurid hyperbole. Where there could have been clouds, there was a smear of brown sepia haze. Where there could have been buildings, there were clusters of dilapidated brick and steel. Every crevice was caked with something black and sooty, every wall tattooed with graffiti. Less a city, more a malignant urban growth. All of this, Barbet was perfectly content not to notice. She looked out through the eyes of the sagging rubber cat mask the stranger had given her, searching for the sources of sounds. It jiggled with the motion of her head as she craned to catch the few wisps of conversation that came floating her way. There were people here, easily as many as in Buskin, but not a soul among them in a crowd. The effort not to touch, not to hear or be heard, not to be noticed in any way, was palpable. There were pedestrians who squeezed themselves against the grimy walls as they walked, as if high up on a ledge. There were folk who vanished into the dangerously yawning black spaces between buildings. There was even a fair amount of traffic across the jagged and treacherous roofscape above, all to avoid the main stream of traffic. Now and then Barbet would hear a passerby mutter something under their breath, and she would stop in the middle of the street, wheel around, and stare in their direction like a household pet who's heard a ghost. And to her, that's all they turned out to be. Nothing people with voices too quiet to make them real. Good thing, too. It made the stranger's job shepherding her miles easier than it had been in Buskin. He hated both cities for different reasons, but if there was one thing he credited this one for above the other, it was the relative quiet. Maybe their masks were uglier, monsters and ghouls and absurdist caricatures that meant nothing if you weren't in on the joke. Maybe any one of them would stab you in the back if it made them feel better. Maybe everyone in Buskin was right to call these people spooks. But at least there was no pageantry. No grand displays here, no sir. No one would tolerate that kind of thing. As the stranger basked in the lack of demonstrations, the two of them passed by something on a brick wall which, with some effort of the imagination, could have possibly been a painted mural. Fox's was here, it tried to say, in big red misspelled words over a splattering of black and white. A small pack of foxes stood before it, wielding paint cans and brushes lashed to long poles. The city was lousy with the little troublemakers, scurrying all over in their white masks and pointed snouts. Here, they were just part of the ecosystem, more native pests than genuine provocateurs. Every now and then they managed to do something terrible and poignant, but mostly it was petty graffiti or vandalism. These 5 or 6 were busy fixing the mural, which meant changing the misspelling from Fawkes to Faxes. The ongoing struggle to get it right was visible in the faded bones of countless overwritten letters beneath. So close this time. Maybe the next bunch would get it down? The stranger wasn't confident in that, but he smiled anyway. Unlike in Buskin, where he'd been on the prowl for a place to put Barbet to work, he knew his mark before he ever set foot in Buskin. The only thing that made it difficult was the fact that he was looking for a bar. And looking for a particular bar in Sock was like looking for a particular shred of hay in a haystack. They passed dive after grimy dive, lined up on either side of the streets in a never-ending parade of inebriation. They were all pretty much the same routine. Dim lights, loud music, news trying to be heard from a radio somewhere in the room. If the regulars didn't recognize you, they would glare with a force which could physically push you back out the door. If you had the misfortune to inhale, you'd taken the cumulative result of several million cigarettes, a rainforest dew cover of armpit sweat, and the alcohol-flavored omniburp which permeated the very soul of the establishment. Each of them was over-brimming with luxuries of this variety, but only one had the distinction of hosting the stranger's quarry, Tom Huggins. After a lot of looking, and a lot of disgruntled patrons looking back, they finally came to the place. It was called the Smiling Toad. Its namesake had been painted on the old wood of the door. The bust of a toad, one pensive green human hand on its chin. It smiled at the stranger as he approached, as if it knew something he'd rather it didn't. He put one of his big hands on its face and pushed it out of the way. Inside, the bar was identical to all the others. Or it would have been, if there wasn't a crowd gathered near the counter. A rare example of flocking spooks, all staring out of their unpleasant masks at the same thing. Before the bar, backlit conveniently by the lights in a way which darkened his features, sat the hulking shape of the man himself. Through the cigarette gloom, it would have been easy to mistake his face for a particularly grisly mask. He had a jaw like a shovel full of crooked teeth, complexion just cleaner than a leper's. The tiny slivers of his eyes glistened from the center of his face with reptilian astuteness. To Barbet, he was exactly as the signs in Buskin had stenciled him, every bit the troll. The only thing the Don't Hug Me's had missed with their signs was the cigar hanging from the corner of his mouth. Too big to be a cigar, actually. It was what he called a Churchill. All of this probably amounted to something pretty imposing, although it didn't occur to Barbet to be intimidated just then. In fact, until he opened his mouth again, nothing in particular occurred to her at all. It did, however, occur to the stranger. He felt himself shrink back behind the automaton as they crossed the bar. It wasn't the way the man looked that did it. He'd seen Tom before, in a place where things have the decency to look more or less like what they really are. Huggins may not have been the pinnacle of human beauty, but he wasn't the monster Barbet was seeing either. At least, he didn't look like it. No, it wasn't Huggins himself that had the stranger cowering in his robe. It was the state that Huggins was in, and how livid the entire room seemed to be over it. There was a radio on the bar counter, chattering about the No More Hugs mob, pouring out praise for their bravery. Fearless folk who came together for the greater good, they called it. Tom wheezed out an incredulous laugh and clicked the dial off.
Brave?
He looked at the crowd.
Is that what we're calling it? Brave for 1,000 people to do this to one guy.
He gestured at himself with a sweeping motion, meaning his 2 black eyes, the bandage around his head, the cast on his leg. Someone behind the counter blew a raspberry inside of his mask, which was a very wet mistake. He didn't acknowledge it. His mask made him look like he was wearing a jack-o'-lantern, except instead of a pumpkin, the features were somehow carved into a head of dripping golden-brown turkey gravy. His voice was like oil, if oil could have a lisp.
I mean, all you gotta do to be brave over there is shout real loud. They'll think you're their return messiah or something.
That's smoke culture for you,
said Tom.
One of them gets it in their head that a lynch mob is justice, and suddenly you've got bruises all over and a burnt-down office. Just like lemmings.
Hey, we gotcha, boss. Right, Nark?
Gravy looked at the other person behind the bar, who was a small fellow in a black horned knight's helmet. The helmet was a bit on the large side and bobbled around on his head as he nodded.
You got run of our place while you're out of a studio,
Gravy went on.
and honestly, I'm thinking it'll do you some good. Someone like Domino tries to come around here?
He shook his head and dragged a finger across his soupy throat.
Sounds about right,
said Huggins, taking the stump of his Churchill from his mouth. He appraised it with mock interest, like somebody pretending to look at their watch.
I can tell you're ready to show her some teeth. I mean, she's already here after all, isn't she?
The stranger had slowly been piloting Barbet into the crowd to get her near the action. He froze, staring out of the side of his mask at the big troll. Huggins was looking sideways in his direction. Was that it, then? Had they figured him out before he'd done anything? He'd known they'd be more skeptical than the Buskinites. If you weren't one of them, if you didn't think in the precise way that they did, they'd find a fault with you before too long and eject you from their little bubble of hatred. He knew from experience. He was actually counting on it happening to Barbet, but not yet. Not before they fell for her. Even worse than the whole thing failing, did Huggins know what he'd done in Buskin? What Barbet had caused? Visions of what a room full of angry spooks might do to somebody like him shuddered through his mind. He felt his muscles go steely as Tom raised the Churchill butt toward the two of them, felt the heat rush into his face as if the burning tip were only inches away. Tom flicked the stump at them, and everyone turned to watch it sail through the air and hit Barbet between the eyes. That is, the picture of Barbet. The one pinned to the wall just to her left. In it, she was wearing the domino mask. There were tiny holes peppered through the photograph, throwing darts sprouting out of her eyes and mouth. The cigar stump left a tiny soot mark where it struck, and then tumbled down like a pachinko ball between the darts.
It's a good look for her,
he said, reclining against the bar. Two small spooks materialized from the gloom surrounding Huggins, one with a new Churchill, the other with a match to light it. It was an automatic process, just something that happened. He didn't even seem to realize, continuing to smoke as if the new cigar had been in his mouth all along.
But listen, I gotta tell you, boys, he went on, that's Mook thinking. They're the ones who get all up in arms over one person saying one thing. They're the ones who shut you up. Believe me, I like her just as much as you do, but forget about Domino. She's just the loudest voice in the room.
The stranger stopped, holding his breath. He'd been gripping Barbet's shoulders so hard there were big, shallow depressions in the polished wood where his fingers had been. She didn't notice or care. All of her attention was wrapped up in the first real conversation she'd heard since they'd arrived in the city. She stared with her painted eyes as Huggins, Gravy, and Nark made the slow metamorphosis, word by word, from indistinct mask-wearing things into people.
Real problem, said Huggins, is that this happens at all. It's bigger than one person coming along and stirring the pot. They're building a culture of suppression over there. Been doing it for years, and it's okay because they call it justice. At this point, they can do almost whatever they want, long as they're righteous enough about it.
Bunch of cucks,
Gravy scoffed.
Actual textbook definition, cucks.
Well, actually, said Nark, raising a small, black, gauntleted finger, according to the dictionary definition of the word cuckold, they would have been cucks if they didn't do anything.
Oh, shut up. It's a figure of speech,
Gravy snapped.
That's missing the point, said Huggins. Doesn't matter what you call them, mooks, lemmings, cuckolds. Point is, all I did was speak my piece. All any of us do. When, I ask you, did that become a punishable offense?
Well, said Nark, punishable by whom? Really, just about anything can be a punishable offense, given the right—
No, you know what it is,
Gravy cut in.
It's frontier justice is what it is. Anything turns punishable when you got enough people with pitchforks in one place.
Huggins pointed an assenting finger at Gravy.
Well, that's just it, isn't it? It's punishable not because there's some law or mandate we can all agree on that justifies the whole bloody thing. It's punishable because they literally have the ability, the numbers, to punish us for it.
Huggins took a long drag. The tip of his Churchill glowed in the light like a single red eye. When he spoke again, it was through a fresh cloud of smoke.
Crying shame how many people in this world would rather snuff out the truth than face up to it.
No, Gravy whined in a nasal voice. 'Cause the truth makes them feel bad. And God forbid anyone has to feel bad. He scoffed. Mooks. And then, quieter, cucks. Nark raised a finger in protest, but met eyes with Gravy before the words came out and thought better of it.
Here's some truth for them, said Huggins. They're deluded. The truth is all there is, and they never stop fighting it. If you're gonna be a mindless zealot, picking up every cause that comes your way, you better expect the onlookers to see a lemming. If you roll over every time somebody tells you they have feelings, you have no right to be surprised when somebody points out the fact that you're a cuck. And if you're gonna let other people make up your mind for you, be their little attack dog, why is it a surprise that we're calling you a mook? The truth isn't always sunshine and rainbows, but it never hurt anybody. Least, he said, rubbing one of his bruised eyes, not the way lies do.
Kinda makes you want to shut up and shout all at the same time, you know? Said Gravy. He held up his hands like a pair of scales. 'Cause on the one hand, you never know who's listening and if they're gonna think you deserve a lynch mob. On the other hand, screw that. You gotta be able to speak the goddamn truth, even when it's not fluffy, bubbly, nice stuff. Ding, went Barbet's invisible egg timer. Textbook suppressiculture, she offered, out of nowhere. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Barbet in her rumpled, ill-fitting cat mask. The features were done in ink, but so sloppily that they only managed to look like a preschooler's crayon drawing. It had an eyebrow raised and an eyebrow lowered, which, the stranger hoped, gave it a nice skeptical expression. You what? Said Gravy, after a moment. To the stranger's surprise, Barbet scoffed at Gravy in almost the exact way he'd been scoffing about mooks. She squeezed into the circle of Big Tom's light, sat on one of the empty bar stools beside him, and said to Gravy, Seriously? It's a textbook obviousality. Obviously, mooks use the politotactic of not allowing freedom through pushing their lemming suppressiculture agenda. What part of that don't you get? More silence. Nark was trembling. He looked like he was about to explode with all the pent-up corrections Barbet deserved, but Gravy clapped a hand over his helmeted mouth before it could happen. Ah, he said, with a sideways glance at Barbet. You okay there, friend? You got all your marbles? She scoffed again, and then again said, Obviously. You a mook there, friend? Got all your feelings? They stared at each other from across the bar, faces inscrutable beneath their masks. The stranger could nearly taste the tension in the air, as palpable as the sweat and beer and smoke. The room was a pack of wolves, ready to pounce. This was the way with spooks. Too gentle, and they'll never even realize you exist. Too aggressive, and they'll gut you where you stand. He'd seen it happen a dozen times. An entire second passed in silence. Then 2. Then 3. And then... Huggins burst out laughing. It was a deep, thunderous sound, which seemed to shake the foundations of the bar itself. The stump of the new Churchill fell from his gaping mouth and onto the bar counter. Gravy, Nark, and the rest immediately cowered at the sound, beta wolves before their alpha. Gravy even made a feeble attempt to join in, but it sounded thin and fragile.
Talk about cuckolds,
Huggins roared, shaking Gravy by the scruff of his neck the way you would a feisty puppy. He looked in at Gravy through the eyeholes of his mask.
Are you a mook? You want to crucify her just 'cause she shows up and uses some big words you don't understand? Mook thinking.
He held eye contact with Gravy for a long moment, a way for them to say to each other, Do you understand? And yes, without the rest of the room hearing. He nodded a few times and gave Gravy a very masculine thump on the back.
Look,
he went on.
It's not how I choose to put it, but the whole suppressiculture thing, that's what I've been getting at. This is us, he said, pointing at the smoldering butt of his Churchill on the bar counter. Ugly little piece of burning truth. And this... He paused to search for something, settled on Nark's mug, threw the contents over his shoulder, and incidentally onto the audience behind, who didn't seem to mind, and thumped the empty glass down beside the butt. This is them. Empty vessel, ready to suck up whatever stupidity comes their way. Now, we're harmless, we keep to ourselves. But how are we supposed to help it if the truth
He waved a hand back and forth through the ribbon of smoke rising off the Churchill stump.
Gets out there. Who can blame us for that? The nature of publishing. But see,
he said, slowly picking up the cup and turning it upside down.
The Mooks? They aren't just offended. Oh no. They're empty. Blank. Define themselves by what they don't want us to say or do.
With a note of finality, he placed the upended cup down over the cigarette butt. The smoke began to fill it up, hiding the Churchill stump in a milky white haze. Huggins folded his arms, looked around at the other spooks.
Their entire culture is fear, disallowance, suppression.
Mook suppressiculture, Barbet repeated. Huggins snorted.
I'd call it censorship society, but sure, if you like, suppressiculture.
The stranger was still in the larger crowd, outside the halo of Huggins' light. All around him he heard a cricket chorus of hushed assents and acknowledgments, saw heads nodding and shoulders shrugging. He observed in awe as a room full of monsters, ghouls, assorted spooks of every description digested his translation of Barbet's algorithmically generated gibberish. He was too impressed to be giddy. He expected them to be a harder sell than this. For a moment there, it had looked like they wouldn't be sold on Barbet at all, spooky cat mask or no. According to the plebeian lemming logic of Mooks, we are an oppressionarchy. Because that makes sense, said Barbet, shrugging dramatically at her new audience. The stranger made an involuntary snort and moved to cover his mouth. No one heard because they were too busy chuckling, actually chuckling, without any worldly clue what she was or what it was that they were agreeing with.
That even mean anything, Nark?
Said Gravy. Oppressionarchy? The little knight sputtered, overwhelmed just to be noticed. No. I mean, not strictly. It seems made up. Maybe a portmanteau of oppression and—
Just what I expected from a bunch of mooks,
Gravy interrupted.
Picking up whatever phrase is thrown at them and sticking it on as many banners as possible. They don't even care if it means anything, long as it gives them something to shout about.
Well, that's it exactly. Oppressionarchy's got to be one of the most incredible things that's ever come out of Buskin. Think about it. Between that and the irony of using the phrase "no more hugs" in defense of kindness, I could probably write a pretty good Today in Idiocy about this whole thing. That is, if I still had an office, said Huggins.
I hear you, boss. What's the plan on that, anyway? Like, you want to get a new place, get Bear Hug back up and running, you know we're going to support you. But what I'm trying to figure out is, what'll stop him from burning that down, too? No offense, but you're already pretty beaten up. Don't know how you'd fare a second time.
Look, said Barbet, placing her hands on the bar counter like a pair of cleavers, it's obvious that the only way to make a freedom is the impunification of our truth speech. Nark pinched the bridge of his nose between his too big helmet, like he was just barely keeping his head from splitting open by holding on to that one tender spot. Gravy, on the other hand, perked up. He looked from Barbet to Huggins, then back.
So, you mean like, we should be able to say whatever we feel like, without being afraid we'll get mobbed, right?
Not how I'd choose to put it, but if you like. Not even hearing the way she just parroted Huggins, Gravy bobbed his head up and down and began to drum his fingertips excitedly against the bar.
Yeah, okay, that's what I've been saying. It's just the truth about our opinions, right? Doesn't even matter if we're saying that we think they deserve to die. We should be able to say it. No holds barred, no fear.
Matchstick Spook and Churchill Spook appeared once more to restock Tom's empty mouth.
That, he said through a fresh cloud, is our biggest problem. It's not a question of what we're allowed to do, but what they're allowed to do. Offices like the one I used to be a part of will always just let them waltz in and burn the place down. No thought to security or protection. Why? Because it's easier to be rid of me than it is to fight an army. That ain't gonna change anytime soon.
It's not a debation of suppressiculture validity, said Barbet, leaning back on her stool and tilting her head at Huggins in a perfect picture of incredulity. It's a juxtaposition of frontier justice. Enforcement against Buskin is something we shouldn't be afraid to be.
Okay, weird cat person, whoever you are, you're really growing on me. Look,
said Gravy, turning to Tom and the rest of the bar.
If they're just gonna do whatever they want to us, why aren't we doing anything back? Like, we're afraid to speak the truth? No, they should be afraid to get in the way of it.
A flagrant obviousality, said Barbet. There was a scream from behind the bar. Nark was holding the horns of his helmet, as if pulling his own hair. He scrambled up onto the counter and stabbed a finger at Barbet. It isn't an obviousality, he made air quotes with his gauntlets. Because that doesn't mean anything. Neither does debation, air quote, suppressiculture, air quote, and least of all, oppressionarchy, air quote. He struggled to find the words. Impassioned nonsense. She's just as bad as Domino, and if you really start retaliating just because she shows up and starts talking a bunch of exciting nonsense at you, you might as well be a mook. Finally, the stranger leaned forward, watching the moment unfold. Maybe they couldn't see it in Buskin, maybe they were too blinded by their passion, but here in Sock, where cynicism reigns, of course one of them was bound to catch on eventually, and against all odds, it hadn't been Huggins. The big bear himself, arbiter of the obscene, protector of the profane, was so wrapped up in this stranger in her weird cat mask, he had even started to take cues from her. What would everyone say when they realized she was a machine? That they could be so stirred by pure gibberish? What would happen to this bar full of supplicating spooks? If the stranger had been sitting on a seat, he would have been at the edge of it. Instead, he clenched his fists inside his robe to keep them from shooting triumphantly into the air. He watched and waited for them to turn on her, and then on themselves. Seconds ticked by like an eternity, but no one rounded on her. No one made a move to tear off her mask. Instead, Huggins slapped his big hands together, and then again, and again, until the whole room was delivering an emotionless applause. Nark shrunk a little, unsure what to make of the reception.
No, that was good, said Huggins. Really. Thanks for sharing your feelings with us. Is there anything else you want to get out while you're up there? Maybe we can get you a picket sign, too, eh? And an army to march with? Would you like that?
Nark tried to say. He searched the room for any sign of empathy, any inkling of understanding. When he found none, he slinked down off the counter and hid so that only his horns were visible from behind the bar.
As long as we're here, talking through things peacefully, not shouting,
said Huggins, with a pointed glance at the disembodied horns,
we're nothing like them. But you know, Nark, you're right about one thing. Fighting back is mook thinking. That's the difference between us and them. The big one. They're followers, we aren't. Right, boys?
He said to the room in general. There was a cheer of assent.
But we aren't a bunch of cocks, either. Those mooks deserve justice, sure, and if they keep this up, you can bet it'll come to them. But it won't come from us, because there is no us. It'll come from individuals fed up with this suppressiculture thing. Meanwhile, we just keep speaking the truth, however we can. The truth never hurt anybody, after all. Ain't on us if a couple people out there get fed up and give those mooks what's coming to them, is it?
And, what would that be, exactly?
Gravy's voice was low, conspiratorial. A hush fell over the bar as Huggins considered this, a congregation before their prophet. He took a deep pull on his Churchill, and there was the red eye again, staring through the gloom.
Truth is, there needs to be an unmasking. Safe to be part of a lynch mob when nobody knows it's you, but would they be so bold if the masses could hold them accountable for their violence? Would they still fight if they were as vulnerable as I am?
He concluded with a rhetorical shrug. Obviously, Barbet confirmed, meaning the opposite. Something dawned on Gravy then. He looked at Huggins, then at the door, then back at Huggins.
Yeah, I see. That's real interesting.
Awkwardly, his body began to gravitate toward the exit.
I'll have to, cogitate on that one. Yeah. But, kind of a late night for me. I got stuff to do. So, yeah. I'm out. Been a gas, you guys. Hope you figure something out about the new office and all.
Just a matter of time,
said Huggins. He didn't look at Gravy, but there was something that could have almost been a smile on his mouth as he said,
Someone will do the right thing eventually. Put them in their place. No business of mine, though. It'll happen when it happens.
Gravy was already halfway out the door when he said, "Well, here's hoping whatever happens, happens soon. Anyway, good night, guys. See you tomorrow." He interrupted himself with a low curse. One of the straps of his backpack had caught on the doorknob and yanked it off his back, spilling the contents out onto the floor. He cast a glance around the bar to see whether anyone was watching, but they had already lapsed back into the never-ending cycle of their conversation. He let out a relieved breath, stuffed everything back into the bag, and was gone the next moment. Only the stranger, hidden in the shadow of his hood, had seen the fox mask as it fell out of Gravy's backpack. Act 2, Interlude. Somewhere else, a boy who calls himself Nark Dite is staring at his phone, thumb moving frantically against the screen. Names and profile pictures wheel by, too fast to read. Or not names, not profile pictures, but placeholders for the ones that ought to be there. An army of identical, vaguely humanoid silhouettes marching across the screen, trailing a banner of "This account no longer exists." Maybe 1 in 20 is still a distinct person with an identity, but even then their profiles are no longer theirs, painted over with the trauma of exposure. One of the survivors has pinned an image of the smashed-in front door of their apartment to their profile, the result of a misguided raid by police forces informed of a fictitious hostage situation at that address. Another has a screenshot of an email pinned there, explaining in no uncertain terms why they don't need to come into work tomorrow, or ever again. There are death threats and acts of vandalism and pornography of a particularly vengeful variety, and on and on. What had once been a feed of #NoMoreHugs and #Don'tHugMe posts has spiraled into an obituary of digital selves more than 100,000 bodies deep. And Nark, with trembling hands, feels himself at the bottom of it. Close that window. Or no, his thumb lingers there for a moment, doesn't close, minimizes, and then navigates its way over to his internet relay chat. The Smiling Toad, it's called. Nothing fancy, white windows and green borders. They never bothered to gussy it up beyond the default theme. The only indicator you're even in the right chat are the name, the ever-grinning image of the cartoon toad in the top right, and the familiar list of active users. At the top of the list, under the word admins, are the usernames Nark_Dite, 69GravyGast96, and, as of less than a week ago, Tom Bear Huggins. He thumbs Tom's username, but pauses before the touch can register. Is Tom really the person he needs to talk to? What would Tom even do? Celebrate, probably. Awkwardly, he maneuvers his thumb away from Tom's name and onto Gravy's. A new window blossoms open, full of private exchanges that go so far back they predate the creation of the toad itself. He tries and deletes several attempts to start the conversation. Gravy must already be there, watching the little typing animation at the bottom of the window, because before Nark can get anything out, new text dings into existence. 69GravyGast96. Sup? Typing. About 30 more seconds of typing. Nark Dite. Hey, is there any chance you happen to have an idea of who doxed all those people? Gravy. Little yellow emoji face, an eyebrow raised, hand rubbing its chin. Doxed? More like unmasked, LOL. What? How isn't it doxing? I mean, by every possible definition, reputable or not, releasing the names, addresses, phone numbers, emails, and workplaces of those people was absolutely, inarguably doxing. Nah, LOL. They let all that info go on their own when they signed up for Podium to roast Tom. All someone would have to do is get at that database and boom. Their fault, honestly. Nark. ... Is that seriously all you have to say for yourself? You realize you put a truly unprecedented number of people in harm's way, right? Never said I did it, did I, Nark? If you're not going to use any grammar or punctuation, can you at least spell my name right? You know, having people call me Nark without the K in front makes me feel like a snitch. Are you? I haven't ratted you out yet, have I? N3 ever said it was me. Shrug emoji. Gravy, come on. We didn't start this chat to organize attacks on innocent people. It was just supposed to be a nice, safe place for us to actually speak our minds. Yep. Goddamn hidey hole. Whoop-de-doo. You seriously want to spend all your time in here? Like, stay scared to ever post anything honest anywhere on the internet ever again? Well, obviously not, but you're drawing up a false dilemma here. It's not shut up or knuckle up, Gravy. You don't have to be violent to have your way. LOL. Yeah, okay. Tell them that. You know Skepticat and Tom were right. Now Domino and all them are gonna think twice before pulling something like that again, aren't they?
Narc. ... So is this how we're doing things now? Internet trench warfare?
Yeah, pretty much, LOL.
Well, what if I don't like that? What if I miss just talking about things? What if I decide to try and keep someone from doing something like this again?
LMAO. Okay. Narc. 1. IDC. Do what you want. I never said it was me. 2. Won't matter. It's like Tom says. No matter what you do, somebody's gonna get fed up and do something sooner or later. 3. I know who you are. Andre Cervantes. Male. 19. Vermilion, South Dakota, USA. You think I didn't?
The phone falls from Narc's hands and lands like a knuckle blow between his eyes. He's too shocked to do anything but blink. Was that a threat? After all their time building the Toad together, painstakingly carving out one single space on the internet for people to speak their minds without fear, is Gravy really holding him at info point? The thought doesn't make sense. He tries to grasp it in his head, but the irony makes it slick and amphibious, and it keeps wriggling away from him. The whole point of the Toad, of Bear Hug, of his friendship with Gravy, was supposed to be that they weren't like all those people in #NoMoreHugs. The truth was just the truth. You speak it, but it's never supposed to hurt anyone. That's what Tom always says, isn't it? So why is... Act 3. The City of Lost Things. The old city was the only one watching when, like a pair of soldiers dishonorably discharged, the two of them came slinking back. It wasn't a judgmental gaze, but it was familiar in a way the stranger didn't like. Welcome back, it seemed to say, to the place of things abandoned and unwanted. Welcome home. Their old footprints were still there in the sand, untouched. The booth was waiting for them, door wide open. This was the third time he'd made the trip, the second with Barbet in tow. The first time he had brought her back had been a simple matter of course, a cleansing of the palate between buskin and sock. This was something else, furious, final, deliberate. With one big hand cuffed around her tiny wrists, he dragged her out of the surf, up the beach, back to the booth, and stuffed her inside. He meant to slam the door shut, but forgot he'd broken the latch, and it came back open with a pathetic creak. He looked at the door as if it knew what it had done wrong, wanted to throttle the cheeky piece of wood. Instead, exercising perhaps more strength of will than he ever had in his life, he delicately eased the door into its frame, seated the loose bolt in its bent latch. Barbet settled back into place with the mechanical precision of a key in a lock. In one rigid motion, she plucked the tragedy and comedy masks from their hooks, turned to face the shattered window, and fell back into the still portrait of a circus damsel deciding which to wear. The stranger stared at her for a moment, and scoffed. The girl in the portrait had acquired an article of clothing you could almost mistake for a rubber cat mask, which sagged dejectedly off her face, rather destroying the whole effect. He reached through the broken pane, tore it away, flung it into the ocean, and then tried again. This time, when he looked at her, something happened. A shift, a sorting. Without consulting him, he found his brain had taken the image of tools decaying on a neglected workbench, locked it away in a tackle box, and hidden it in some dark, cobwebbed corner of his mind. He could no longer seem to see the weathered, pale wood of her skin, the rusting joints between. All he could see was her painted makeup, carven chestnut curls, the slender grace of her figure and face. Looming there in his huge cloak, grotesque red skull grinning from the cowl like a devil out of hell, she was the opposite of a mirror to him, a reflection of every lovely thing he lacked. He punched the Admit 1 button with his thumb. The out-of-tune circus calliope began to wheeze its way out of the hidden speakers, the automated message out of Barbet's mouth. Welcome, one and all.
Oh, shove it, you useless thing.
The music stopped. Barbet stopped. She stared at him with her soulless smile.
You want to listen to something? Fine. Listen to this.
He gripped the window frame hard enough to shake the whole booth, leaned in close.
Whoever made you, I get why they left you here to rot. You're a mistake, a walking malfunction. I'm probably the last person who will ever take the time to track you down, and God knows it wasn't worth it. One broad burlesque, more like one bot.
He searched for something that both started with a B and meant troublemaker, but found nothing. He wouldn't think of one dame demagogue for several more weeks, but by then it would be far too late for a proper jab.
They were only supposed to buy your act for a second. One single second. Where was the part where they step back and go, wow, do I really sound that stupid? Because that's what you're supposed to make them do. Not go, oh yeah, you're right, weird robot with bad grammar. I am a genius. They were supposed to see what they're really like for just one moment, and maybe, just maybe, they'd be ashamed of it. God, it could have been so good. I think you made them even worse, if that's possible. I mean, they were obnoxious before, but at least they weren't lynch mobs and vigilantes.
He slipped a hand beneath his mask and rubbed at his face.
You know what the weirdest thing is, though? They loved you. They really did. Or at least, they listened to you when you said stuff.
He didn't want to look at her anymore, frozen there in the window, smiling her indifferent smile. He turned toward the beach and began to pace back and forth, kicking up clumps of wet sand.
Doesn't make any sense. If some random stranger came up to me and poured out the nonsense that you do, I might be curious for a second, but after that I'd get annoyed and tell them to piss off. I don't know how you, fumbling idiot robot, are more worth their time than me. None of them ever paid that much attention to anything I ever said to them, and I'm an actual person, with actual legitimate stuff to talk about. Real challenging conversations worth having. You waltz up, found out a bunch of gibberish, and they praise your name. But me? Nope. No, sir. No crowd for me. Kick me out of the bar. Doesn't make any goddamn sense,
he said, emphasizing the word God with a kick that sent a tiny shower of sand into the sea. He collapsed onto the beach and sat there as if he were a big black boulder washed in by the tide. He might as well have been for all the good talking was doing him. He didn't know if the words were meant for Barbet, or for himself, or the twin skylines of Buskin and Sock out there on the horizon. He stared at them for a long time before he said anything else. The fist-like towers of Buskin in all their righteous uniformity, the malignant urban mass of Sock.
Bunch of mooks and spooks.
He tasted the words in his mouth and frowned.
No, that's not enough. You put on a show like you're different from each other, but really you're all the same. Mouth-breathing, hive-mind, self-righteous, do-whatever makes me feel like I'm right normies. With the way you act, I'd be surprised if there are even people under those masks.
The words were pouring out of him now, a sour morass in his gut that his body needed to be rid of.
You're not people. You're mindless, faceless, feeble creatures with no thought in the world except to protect yourselves. If you could see what you're actually like for 1 second, one single second, you'd be disgusted. You'd hate yourselves as much as I do, and then some. But you don't have to worry about that, do you? You wouldn't even know if you were looking at yourself. Hell, you didn't this time. What kind of self-respecting, intelligent person doesn't even know their own reflection when they see it? No kind. That's who. You're no kind of people.
This went on and on, spiraling ever deeper into the pit of his hatred. Now on his knees, now on his hands and knees, now punching the sand with each syllable, voice breaking in a way that wasn't at all becoming of his Red Skull's grin. Minutes passed in the form of unpunctuated paragraphs. His voice was beginning to grow hoarse with the exertion, although he didn't realize it. He was in the middle of making an ethical case against the two cities, trying to convince them of how toxic their very existence was to people like him, when the diatribe caught in his throat. There was a hand on his shoulder. "You're right, about everything." Barbet was standing beside him. There were fresh tracks in the sand leading from her booth. He hadn't heard the door come open, hadn't seen the masks go back on their hooks, hadn't noticed the life return to her. The ratcheting had gone out of her voice again. She stared down at him with her brown, painted eyes, face a mask of pity. No, not pity. Worse than that. He recognized the expression. It was the one mothers give their children when they have a boo-boo in need of a kiss. He jerked his shoulder out from beneath her hand.
Excuse you, I'm having a conversation here.
Oh? Who with? The stranger looked from Barbet to the twin skylines, and then back.
Not you,
he said, more sheepishly than he would have liked. Barbet shifted backward, brows vaulted. So, what, you'd rather talk to the ocean than to me?
Well,
he said, idly beating the sand from the knees of his robe as he came to his feet.
See, you're an automaton. Worse, you're one made particularly to talk a lot of nonsense.
He gestured toward the one broad burlesque moniker atop her booth.
So sure, I'll talk at you, I'll do that all day. But to you, that's another story. Nothing you can say will be of use to me, so why would I want to hear it?
Barbet's brows fell like guillotines. Her mouth hung open. Because I can think and feel, and I have things to say that matter, you ass! A wave of heat washed over the stranger's face and neck. He stared dumbly at her for several long seconds, not knowing what to say. He hadn't realized the machinery of her face was capable of producing this depth of emotion, hadn't known her voice could inflect this way. Weren't you just delivering a speech about how bad it is that they wouldn't even listen to the things you had to say? That they couldn't even stop to look at themselves, see how they're behaving? If you can't even pay me the decency to hear me when I'm trying to comfort you, what makes you any better than they are?
Hey, he snapped. Don't you compare me to them. I'm just being sensible here. I mean, you weren't half this well-spoken as Domino or Skepticat, or even when I got you going about that conspiracy stuff forever ago. How was I supposed to know there was more going on underneath it? You have to admit, you really look like a busted machine.
I bet. And when they look at you, I'm sure all they see is a very reasonable, like-minded fellow human, someone they would just love to know better. A photo album of every mask he'd ever tried on fluttered through his mind, coming to rest at last on the red skull hanging in the black cowl. He saw himself there on the beach, and decided that, no, he probably wouldn't approach himself if given the choice. He probably wouldn't have approached any of the selves he'd been.
Okay, touché, but I don't want that anymore, so this suits me fine.
My point is, said Barbet, holding up her hands in a way that meant stop talking at me and start talking to me, you don't know me, and you haven't been trying to know me. I understand that you have some impressions based on what you saw in Buskin and Sock, but can you blame me? You had me trying to act like them. Of course I was going to come off stilted, weird, disingenuous. That's what they're like. He recalled what it had been like to read the conspiracy theorist's script to her, that wrongness in the soul. Had she felt the same, repeating those sentiments back to him? Had she felt like this the whole time, beneath every mask he'd forced her to wear? He squinted at her through the eye-holes of his own, as if he might be able to see through her if he just looked hard enough.
There's a lot more going on in there than it looks like, huh? He said.
Barbet shrugged and pointed a lazy finger at him. More than what's going on in there, at least. Her wry tone caught him off guard. Then again, almost every tiny expression of her strange humanity did that. He tried to keep it down to a snort, but the laughter was unstoppable.
I guess I can't argue with that,
he said when his breath returned.
Sorry, you're a robot. I never expected you to be in a position to make proper jabs like that, at least not at me. You're kinda special, huh?
That's a way to put it. Assuming you really do want to know, she said, looking at him severely out of the corner of her eye. It's more like I'm different, but the same. I only have two real edges over you people, experience and retention. I can recall anything I'd like at the drop of a hat. No brain fog, no memory lapse, and I have a lot to recall.
How do you mean?
I may be a little rusty, but this isn't my first circus act. Not by a long shot. I was hot stuff back when this place was still kicking, she said, twirling a dreamy hand in the direction of the old city, the wreckage of the boardwalk carnival. The motion almost looked as if it was meant to brush the gray away, People tried all kinds of things with me. If you can think of it, that's what they did. So I've been around the block, done more than my share of impressions.
You must know a thing or two about people then, huh?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. Really, it amounts to one thing. She looked him in the eyes. You know what that is? He had a guess, but shrugged instead of offering it. You do, actually. I know you do, because it's exactly what you were saying before. They're no kind of people. Was that malice in her eyes? Pain? Reading the emotion in them was like trying to read the future in a crystal ball. It transfixed him, made him want to understand, wish that he could look out through them and see what she saw. They're more mechanical than I am, she went on. More predictable. Until now, I thought that was just how things were. They used to come to me, have me do my silly, stilted impressions, and then blame me for the strangeness they saw reflected back. To be human was to be scared of your own reflection. She pressed a fingertip to his chest. Through the layers of fabric, he could almost believe it wasn't a cool, lacquered wooden surface at all, but warm flesh. The mysterious look in her eyes seemed to soften, resolving at last into, what was it? Gratitude? You are the single member of your species who could have changed that impression, and you did. With you, for the first time, I did more than make them laugh or grimace. I wasn't just an oddity or a broken tool. I mattered to them, changed them. It took a force of will not to continue staring at her, mouth open beneath his mask. For the first time in a long time, cynicism was something he had to work at. He crossed his arms beneath her finger.
Changed them into crazed lunatics? Yeah, I saw. Your job was to make them better, not worse.
My job, she said, prodding her finger into his chest, was to do my best impression of them, which is exactly what I did. It's not my fault that wasn't enough to make them vomit with shame. What I will take credit for is getting them to do things they wouldn't otherwise have done. We changed them. Do you get that? She took handfuls of the fabric around his shoulders and tried to shake him, but he was too heavy for her and she just ended up rattling herself around. That's what I'm trying to tell you. They can't see themselves in the mirror, they can't tell a parody from a prophet, but there's only so much they can change before they... She let go of him and looked at her open hands as if they might contain the words she was looking for, then gave up and threw them in the air. Before they change! The stranger's hand disappeared into the darkness of his hood to stroke his chin.
You mean, he finally said, if we push them far enough, they'll have to see it. Like, if I get you, you're saying we need to get them to do something they could never justify, and then, he snapped his fingers, no way to hide from it anymore.
Barbet snapped her fingers back at him, or she tried to. Without skin, it doesn't really work. Ding, ding, ding! You've got it. It's not that we failed before, we just didn't finish. Those were only our first little baby steps, and if you think about it, it really is impressive how far we got with them. The stranger did think about it. It played like a movie montage in his mind, embarrassingly poor, tremulous shots of Barbet, followed by cutaways to the cinematic new reality he was beginning to see. One moment, she was in buskin, looking like a cheap Halloween store prop, waving a cardboard sign. The next, she was leading an army of silhouettes through the twilight, bathed in the glow of their torches. One moment, she was in sock, arguing semantics with a bunch of barflies. The next, she was a phantom wreathed in cigarette smoke, whispering into the ear of a demagogue. And then the memories fell away, and it was only a stream of possibilities. Mass fires in buskin as righteous anarchy took its toll, echoing silence in sock, each and every one of them too scared of each other to speak.
You really think we can do that?
His voice came out low, husky, as if he were an addict inquiring about some very illegal drug in a public place. With your ingenuity and my irresistible charm, she bat her eyelashes at him dramatically. We'll give them what's coming to them. We'll change the world. This time, he didn't have to drag her along. She slipped her hand into his. Lead the way, the gesture said.
Well, all right then,
he said with a small laugh.
I guess we're still in business. Buskin first?
Sounds like a good time to me.
Right. Well, first things first, you need tidying up,
he said, guiding her back toward the booth. She didn't argue with that. Once she was inside and ready, he thumped the window frame twice and tipped his hood to her.
See you on the other side.
She grinned, but didn't say anything else. Admit one, the old domino mask back on her face, and out into the surf they went, toward the city of raised fists. The montage continued to play in his head, fueled him. All the terrible things she would make them do, the sides of themselves they'd be forced to show, and by the time they realized what they were doing, he froze. A single image had intruded into the picture show, only for a moment, a frame. Still, there it was, cut between the self-immolating mooks and the terrified spooks, a grinning red skull hanging in the cavern of a dark hood. It hovered like a plague over the destroyed city skylines, the earth carpeted in tortured human silhouettes below. From each of the skull's 2 sockets, there stared a glassy, painted brown eye. He cast a backward glance at Barbet. She stared back with her soulless smile. There was nothing in her carved, vacantly expressive features to find. No subterfuge, no hidden cunning. It was as if the person he'd been talking to barely a minute ago had been erased with the press of a button. All he saw was the stranger, reflected in the polished wood of her eyes. "Oh," he said, and let go of her hand. Act 3, Interlude. Somewhere else, someone is staring glassy-eyed at a website very few people have ever heard of. His face is red in the glow of its wallpaper, head cowled in the darkness of the surrounding room. Beyond the drone of the laptop's fan, the only sound is a quiet, "oh," which he barely hears himself make. His eyes are still scanning the chat history, pupils darting back and forth like the carriage of a busy typewriter. The text is all wrong, changed right before his eyes. What had moments ago been a life-altering exchange about society and identity and forcing people to confront themselves is really just embarrassing. The kind of cringe-fest people take screenshots of and post on social media. The kind he'd been putting others through for the last several days. The bot's messages are so full of typos, linguistic inventions, Frankensteinian abominations of grammar, they make his passionate responses look like lines from a bad play. Just by responding to it earnestly, he's somehow become complicit in the performance. He hadn't felt that way when the words were coming out of him, though. Everything he had said, everything the bot had said back, it all seemed so real at the time. As if, for once, somebody was actually listening to him, agreeing with him. Validation of a kind he'd never before received, all reduced in a moment of revelation to a bunch of text. A set of algorithms designed to find the intent behind his words and fountain it back in spectacular gibberish. And for one glorious moment, he had basked in it, let himself be swaddled in the illusion that someone out there seemed to understand him better than he did. He pulls the chain on the lamp beside him, and the darkness winks out. His face is no longer a red mask staring out of a black hood. It's the face of a boy, a little younger than 17 years old. Maybe there are more stress lines than someone his age should have, and maybe the bags under his eyes make them look dark and brooding. But right now the normal sharpness is gone. His expression is softer than it's been in a long time, as if there's been a winch in his mind, invisible hands winding it tighter and tighter over the weeks and months and years until the strain of it appeared where you could see. Only now, at last, was it unwinding. He navigates away from the bot's sight, over into the field of tabs he still has open in his browser. Social media sites, mostly. Everything connected to the #NoMoreHugs movement. Now, a post-apocalyptic wasteland of vacated accounts and digital violence. When he opens the Internet Relay chat client, he's still in the Smiling Toad server, now an ongoing funeral procession for a demolished platform. Looking through this stuff is like sifting through rubble, although in search of what? He doesn't know the answer just now, but continues to pick his way through while the winch in his mind unwinds. Is this what he'd wanted? It wasn't why he'd gone through all the trouble to begin with. Coding the transcription application, using it to connect the bot to the Domino and Skepticat dummy accounts, loosing it upon the two communities. It was mostly meant to be a joke. Something for him. He wanted to put them in a spot where they got to feel a little stupid, a little ashamed, and then have a good laugh about it. But it hadn't taken all that much time for the bot to convince him he wanted more than that, either. And the thought scares him, because it is only a bot. It reads, interprets, reflects back what it finds, and nothing more. None of this was the bot's doing. It was all a result of what it had found in him. The truth is that it would have felt good to see all of them cornered, forced to confront the parts of themselves he hates so much. It would have been a confirmation that he doesn't need to belong with any of them, because they were always just violent, self-righteous animals from the start, not worth belonging with. Instead, he'd been right on the precipice of proving that about himself. Maybe he already had. A little more than half an hour passes before he realizes why he's picking through the devastation. The revelation comes to him in the form of 2 usernames he's seen before, one within the #NoMoreHugs feed, one within the Smiling Toad. He's looking for survivors, others who recognized that something was wrong and found their way out before all of this. The few who, unlike him, had no buried motive for the bot to unearth. In the thousands, there are only 2. Someone who calls herself Detoxica02, and another who calls himself Narc-Dite. The boy hesitates. Time passes. Eventually, after much rubbing of the temples and much controlling of the Z, he sends off a pair of emails. Subject line, "There's someone I want to introduce you to." Detegens Drama. The unmasking of the drama, where every respectable performance ends. Only, don't ask the Greek playwright this time, because they'd never use that phrase. When you get to this point in the show, the performers are meant to stop pretending the audience doesn't exist. They're supposed to remove their masks, bow, and weather an assault of flowery things. A few bills if they're lucky, old produce if not. After that, they dislodge from the thespian amalgamate and scramble back off to their lowly individual lives. This is what you might know under normal circumstances as a curtain call. These, however, are not normal circumstances. Movements and dialogues end, characters come and go, but no curtain ever falls over this colossal show. Come back to this theater after a day, a week, a year, after the entire performance has mustified at the back of your mind, and you'll find it still droning on. Different actors, maybe, different scenarios, but always the same story. Buskin raging forever on, arteries full of clotting masses, sock still seething, knife gripped close behind its back. Look, even now Big Troll Huggins is mounting a new platform, buoyed up by the bills and dimes of his spooks. Something more resilient this time, made of a material harder to burn. And there, see? A changing of the seasons for Kitty, Lancey, and the rest of the Mookling masses. Signs which read, "Check your mask now. No more hugs. No more." The wheel of the Twin Cities was never meant to stop turning. After a fashion, this is the case for Barbet as well, but only after a fashion. If you went looking for her along the strip of coast beside the old city, all you'd find now is more flotsam, more debris. If you paid very careful attention, you might find peeling strips of red paint clinging to some of the waterlogged planks, a bent and broken latch in the sand. You certainly wouldn't find an old carnival-themed booth with a shattered window, and you absolutely wouldn't find an automaton inside. If that's what you're after, look for the 4 pairs of footprints in the sand. They should still be there, undisturbed. Find them, and follow them into the old city. Don't worry if they taper off where the sand stops and the streets begin. You'll know where to go. In fact, in the strangeness of the city, there will only be one obvious place to go, toward the single tiny rash of color radiating through the gray like a drop of ink on too thin parchment. Feel your way toward it, through the twisting thoroughfares, between the fantastical, forlorn faces of the shops and buildings. It may take some doing. You may have to get creative, pass over the mismatched roofs, into some doors and out of others. If you're curious enough, though, you will find it. A new attraction in the city, the first in who knows how many uncounted years. The operators will welcome you when you come, and it will be an odd comfort. Something in their behavior, their speech, maybe. The way the small fellow keeps correcting everything you say, the way the tall girl speaks in a low, unaffected tone. They'll be familiar to you in a way you can't place. Ironically, it'll be hard to know whether you know them without their masks. And when they take your ticket, you'll have to wonder how you even got it. Wasn't there a strange ticket man at the gate, face hidden in the darkness of his hood? If you strain your mind, you might just be able to recall. Then again, you might not. The attraction is nothing terribly spectacular. Really just a door with a silver curtain and a silver plate above, which reads Barbet, the living looking glass. The most remarkable thing about it when you approach for the first time will be the colors blossoming against the city's monochrome. The metallic sheen of the curtain and the plate, the timber of the building's flat facade, even the tones of flesh and fabric in the operators, as if this one fragment of the city is blushing at you. If you decide to pass through the curtain, you'll find yourself in a room, except for 2 chairs facing each other, a hand mirror on a stand between them, and an automaton sitting in the chair opposite you. The room will be bare. Sit down, and you'll find your own face reflected in the mirror, where hers ought to be. Your head on her shoulders. Or maybe that's all too abstract for you. You do have your deficiency with 1s and 0s, after all. Fine. For your sake, it might be a little different. It might be a little more like following a few too many suspicious links through a few too many defunct websites. It might be more like a chat window with a bot on the other side who's stolen your social media avatar. It might have the overall feel of a stolen piece of software, rebooted, reskinned, and put to better use. Whatever you see in the glowing rectangle of your world, the effect would be the same. The first time you ever spoke to yourself and got a reply back. You might find her, if you went looking. She might see a hidden face, even through its mask. And at last, here we are, at the end of our aeons-long Terry Pratchett series. We had no idea this story would evolve into such a Byzantine piece of work when we first dreamt it up. Far cry from a short story, it seems we've gone and put together the first ever Foundry novella. And let me tell you, it was an experience. Not only the writing process, but the concepts we investigated as well. Working on this thing has given me a strange new frame of reference for you humans, especially within the arena of the internet. If we hit our mark, hopefully it did the same for you. It may not be a perfect application of the whole unifying voice thing we spoke about in the first episode of the series, but we made an effort. If you decide to give this monolithic thing another pass, see whether you can suss out when and where we chose to use light humor, and, more importantly, why. Our next series is going to be about the ominous, anomalous SCP Foundation, which a lot of you have been requesting for a good long time now. It shouldn't be too long in the making, but in the meantime, if you like this story and you want a little something to fill the gap while you wait, why not pick up a free audiobook courtesy of Audible? They have a huge catalog of books, including the vast majority of those written by Terry Pratchett himself. Actually, the story you just listened to was heavily inspired by the book Small Gods, which is 1 part satire on the nature of belief and 2 parts disgruntled deity trapped in the body of a tortoise. Needless to say, it's absolutely hilarious and shockingly thought-provoking. To get a copy of Small Gods, as well as 2 other free audiobooks, at no cost, all you have to do is sign up for a free 30-day trial with Audible by visiting audible.com/TaleFoundry or by texting the code TaleFoundry to 500-500. Not only is this a couple of free audiobooks, it's also a free way to support the show. You can also support the show by joining the TaleFoundry maintenance crew on Patreon. Not only do our patrons decide the topics for each series and the prompts for our writing groups, they also get to read and review our stories as we write them, changing the final product. A big thanks to all the members of our maintenance crew out there who help TaleFoundry to be the best it can be. And a special thanks to all our artificers, automatists, and constructs, Ark D'Angelo, Brandon Steed, Clockwork, Captain Awesome, Excelsius, Josh Dayton, Keith McDade, Me Go, RPG Grenade, Vasily Herbinka, Walter House, and William Maitland. Thank you. I'm extremely excited to go lose myself in the willful darkness of the Foundation, but I'm also feeling a little forlorn. Normally, this is where I'd share a letter from my mysterious correspondent with you, but, well, I don't exactly have anything to share. I sent my taloids into the Foundry's great press ages ago to send and retrieve another letter, as the routine goes, but this time, they didn't come back. It's not the first time some of them have been away for an extended period, but it is the first time since we discovered that there are other, less friendly things out there in the facility beyond the Foundry. I'm beginning to worry about my correspondent. Maybe convincing them that I'm more than a figment of their imagination wasn't the best idea after all. I suppose time will tell. Until then, that's all for this series. Thanks for watching, and keep making stuff up. I'll see you next time. Bye!